We're going to transition now to our panel, and we have really 4 amazing practitioners and real leading thinkers in this work today, so exciting to have this group. Honestly, they need little introduction, but I will provide quick introductions. Stacey Stewart, of course, is the US President of the United Way worldwide, where she's responsible for all 1,200 United Ways across the country. And before becoming president, Stacey served as the Executive Vice President for Community Impact, Leadership, and Learning. Before being at United Way Worldwide, she also had several leadership positions at Fannie Mae and was the President and Chief Executive of the Fannie Mae Foundation. So wonderful to have you with us here, Stacey.
Good to be here.
We also have Junious Williams, who is the CEO of the Urban Strategies Council. Junious really is a recognized leader in community building and development efforts, both in Oakland and across the country. He has deep expertise in educational equity, having played senior roles at University of Michigan School of Education, Detroit Public Schools, CSU Fresno, and he founded the Saginaw Students' Rights Center and co-founded the Ann Arbor Student Advocacy Center. He also serves as the co-chair of the steering committee for the Oakland Emerald Cities Collaborative, in addition to many other boards. So wonderful to have you here, Junious. And we also have Ben Hecht. Ben is the CEO and president of Living Cities, which deploys a unique blend of grants, loans, and influence to re-engineer obsolete public systems and connect low-income people to places across the country. Living Cities recently announced an expansion of their signature initiative, the Integrated Initiative, to 5 new cities across the country, including my hometown, South Seattle, South King County, which is very exciting. And also, we are really excited to announce that Ben has actually shared his reflections from the first few years of the Integration Initiative and is presenting them for the first time at this convening. So you all really are the first ones to benefit from the wisdom of that work so far. So we'd really encourage you to pick up a copy of those reflections. We'll have them at the resource table. But just very exciting to see the learning that's happening already across the country from that work. So delighted to have all 4 of you here. And you all clearly have been practitioners in collaboration in its many forms, in many scales across the country, and for decades, frankly, well before the collective impact frame was published. I'm curious, as you reflect on the momentum that we're seeing now around this approach, what is it about collective impact that you think is resonating with the field so strongly now? What is it about this approach which is different, perhaps not different, that's really driving the conversation? Want to get us started?
I'll start.
Stacey?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. This is a great opportunity, and frankly, I could just listen to Patrick talk the rest of the afternoon because I thought this is a great lesson for all of us. Thank you, Patrick, for sharing all of that experience. I think it's kind of fundamental to something that Patrick talked about, which is that at some level, a lot of us who've been in this work for many, many years, when you step back for a moment, you can be very satisfied by some successes over some period of time. But, and I'll just speak for our work at United Way, we set a goal for cutting the dropout rate in half by the year 2018. And a lot of United Ways have been involved in education for many, many years, many decades. But the reality is that when we step back and look at all that great work that a lot of us have done, a lot of you all have done, folks around the country, it's easy to be pleased with some of the progress we've made, but it's also, to be clear, we haven't made all the progress that we would like to make. And so, in 2008 when we set these goals, we were still looking at graduation rates in the low 70s and lots of daunting challenges ahead of us. And it was pretty clear that if we were just to stay on the same path of, only funding programs and funding great organizations, that we would probably not be able to meet a much more ambitious, big, hairy, audacious goal by 2018. And so, I think for a lot of us, it was really, what are we about? What's our mission? What are we really in business to do? And it really is to not just go through incremental change, but to actually fundamentally change the outcomes for people in communities, for children, for families who are most vulnerable. And to do that, we'd have to do it a different way. And to look at any one of these issues, whether it's high school graduation or school readiness or kids facing the juvenile justice system, any one of those issues is far too complex and complicated for any one organization, one program alone to solve it all. When you peel back the onion, it's really clear that we've got to, the layers of the onion, it's clear that we've got to take a much different approach to this. And that's what caused us to really relook at how we operate and how we do business, and think about all of the folks that we need to have at the table to tackle some of the most complicated challenges that we face in society. And that's why, you know, I think, again, before the term even came about, we were beginning to really look at how we do business and how we actually get at some of these deeper challenges in different ways, and push ourselves to operate differently so that we could actually see the more fundamental population level change that we really all want to see at the end of the day. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think that's why we're all here.
Yeah. Well, I think it's Einstein that said, you know, doing the definition of insanity is do the same thing over and over again, expect a different result, right? And this really is about doing the work very differently, as you're saying, Stacey. Yeah. I'm curious, reflections from you all. Junious, how do you feel about this work? I mean, again, having done this for decades now.
For me, it's probably more about hope and inspiration. I'm a child of the 60s, involved in a lot of the movements there. And this has a movement feel to me. And I know the metaphor is a bad one, but we used to declare war on problems, war on drugs, war on poverty. It seems like it's sort of a people's war that reflecting some on the lack of the ability of government to move some of these intractable social problems, new sort of spirit, especially among young folks, around having a sense of efficacy to do something about long-term social problems, personal commitment, volunteerism. So I think it's sort of a combination of things. It's also, in its simplest forms, a very convenient and easy model. And a lot of us are looking for roadmaps. How do I understand what's going on, get this complex stuff organized in some way? It may not be totally right, except I at least have a bit of a roadmap for the next few steps. So I think a lot of these factors coalesce, and I know the spirit of a lot of the folks on my staff, a lot of the folks that we engage with, you can tell that there's sort of a movement feeling around the work that I think attracts a lot of interest, not only among funders, but I think a lot of government folks and service providers.
Yeah, that's great. And a framework perhaps deceptively simple, right?
Deceptively simple, yes.
Yes, but alluringly so. Ben, Patrick?
I think, in a weird way, I think the collective impact idea or movement really is built on individual frustration. And that in many ways, I'm totally with Stacey, we've known each other probably as long as you could in professionals for a really long time. And I think what you realize is you wake up one day and you realize all of this great work really hasn't moved the needle. And is this the legacy that I want to leave to the next generation? And I think individuals in the public sector, private sector, philanthropic sectors essentially said, you know, if we don't lead, no one will. And whether we have the authority to do it or, you know, the real or apparent authority, we're going to have to take it. And I think a lot of this is about individuals being frustrated in places, saying, first I'm going to hold up the mirror and I'm going to say, let me do what I can do to both admit that maybe I'm not moving the needle and that I need to change the way I act, but also let's bring all the people around the table who maybe if we aligned ourselves differently, we'd get a very different result.
Yeah. And one other thing I'd like to add too, because I think on top of all of that, I think there's some other dynamics that are going on too. I was just sharing with the table, you know, I live in Washington, D.C., probably one of the most dysfunctional places on the planet right now, as you all know. But what's interesting about that dysfunction that happens in Washington and Congress, between the Congress and the administration, is that people, and I wonder whether or not people are reacting to that by saying, you know what, we don't have to wait on that to solve our challenges. We can actually take these issues on ourselves and figure them out ourselves. And so it feels a little like the people are taking their lives back, their communities back, their states back, their regions back, and are deciding that we're not waiting for Superman. We're not waiting for someone to come and solve our problems. We actually have the power within our own selves to figure this out. If we learn how to work differently together, and maybe a good example of how not to do it is what we're seeing on the national news every night. So there's that going on. I think the other piece of it is just through these tough economic times that we hopefully are emerging from, I think that's put lots of strain on local governments and state governments and a lot of organizations who are now deciding maybe we need to figure out how to leverage the resources we have differently. That's put a lot of pressure on the nonprofit sector for sure. It's put a lot of pressure on funders to figure out how to be much more effective in the work that they're doing, government to figure out how to leverage their limited revenue in different ways. And so I'm just wondering whether or not some of these things have created this perfect storm where all of a sudden this notion of how we can work differently together and see some successes in what we're doing is causing some momentum and people feeling more confident that maybe if we approach it a different way, we can actually achieve some different results. So
yeah, I think that's a great point. The timing is really right for this idea set,
so.
And the opportunity when resources are so scarce for folks to work differently together. But there's hope. I mean, I love Junius's frame of hope around this, right? Absolutely. That we actually can solve these issues.
But I think the other thing that's really important is that it's actually about changing where the billions of dollars being spent go. And I think that is, you were talking so eloquently about some of the big barriers. I think that's a huge barrier because nobody wants to attack that elephant in the room because there's a lot of people who are doing quite well on the way that the billions of dollars are being spent. It's just they're not getting the results that you want. And so I think the critical thing, which is missing in many of these efforts, are people saying actually we are going to redirect the existing billions of dollars, not try to figure out how do we attach something, to Velcro onto this broken system, but actually use our authority, real or apparent, to actually move the redirect those funds.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I want to add to that. I agree with what you're saying wholeheartedly in terms of effective use of existing dollars, but I really don't think we should adopt an approach that says we have enough money targeted to these problems. It's just not true. If you talk about the nonprofit sector, that people have done heroic things being underfunded for years and years. It's one of the things that concerns me about social impact bonds. Effective nonprofits got that way on the backs of their staff who work 16 to 18 hours a day. And nobody can tell me in those funding formulas anything that's going to put enough money on the table to make sure that those people aren't abandoning and neglecting their own kids because of the social thing. I look at the public schools, as Kozel said years ago, it's savage inequality. The fact that we let some kids suffer with far too little money to even think about meeting both their academic and other needs. So I'm tense about the notion that everybody says we got enough money for these social problems, we just need to spend it more wisely. I think if we really use collective impact to do the kind of detailed monetary analysis of what it costs to produce good results, we'll also conclude that we don't have nearly enough money on the table, and Patrick alluded to this, turning around 30 years of disinvestment in some neighborhoods, intergenerational disinvestment in these families, it is going to be expensive to turn around, and I don't think we've got anywhere near the investment we need to make, assuming though that we're not always spending the money wisely that we do have.
There's a connection to that and a thought that I had when you asked about this movement as a whole, and that is that there's a risk, I think, that as we all get excited about collective impact, there will be the natural tendency to call everything collective impact. And the risk here is that I think the reason why this movement, if you will, is catching hold is because it works and the other stuff doesn't, right? So if we allow the term collective impact, if we as a community of practice, as funders especially, allow the term community impact to get watered down, dumbed down, used as an example of what doesn't work, shame on us, because actually when it's done right, which is why I had a 3-hour talk here instead of a 25-minute talk, when it's done right, it works and it works and it works. And I think that's part of the issue of changing the tide of investment is in fact demonstrating that you can use those dollars well, you can get the result that you're trying to get, and it's not just going to go toward the status quo, but it's actually going to move towards results and change.
Yeah. I think this is a really important point, Patrick, because we are seeing the term collective impact being used more and more broadly as time goes on. And as we've seen, the rigor around this, really having data at the center, really having aligned work, really seeing the redirection of both public and private funds at the end of the day is critical to its success. And so I think that's part of the conversation over the next few days is how do we maintain that rigor in this work? And what does that actually mean? And what role do funders play in that? So I think it's a really important point. I'm sure that all of you are receiving funding requests on a daily basis about collective impact efforts that are eager for your support. So how do we all get clear about what this really looks like and what it takes to be successful?
I do think there's also something that Patrick and Casey have modeled so well, which is basically saying what they think has worked and not worked along the way. I mean, there are very few national funders who do what Casey has done, whether it's making connections or all these different initiatives. And I do think that part of this is this rapid prototyping of what's being learned and getting it out. Now there's all these various ways to do it, whether it's 140 characters or blogs or reports. Yeah. But the reality is everybody who's doing it, whether they're doing community development or health or education, they're basically using the same tools. And the substance may differ, but the process is the same. Data collection, and all of that I think are the funders' responsibility. It's not just to fund the work, it's actually to fund the knowledge that will accelerate the velocity of this kind of work being done with the rigor.
That's right. And you set me up, so I can't resist. But of course, that's part of the reason the Collective Impact Forum was created, was really as a field-building entity to accelerate that learning across multiple issue areas. And that's also, I think, one of the really valuable things about having people in the room from many different issue areas and geographies, because that learning is transferable across issue areas. I think that's a great point. So Patrick, you shared with us some of your lessons learned in your talk, and I had asked the panelists also to think about their sort of top 3 takeaways. It's hard to bring it down to 3, but I'd love to have a bit of a discussion about each of your top 3. So if you were to sort of narrow it down, and perhaps building off of some of the things that Patrick shared, what are your top 3 takeaways in how to do this work well, and in particular, what it means for funders? Well, you want to start, Stacey?
Yeah, I'll start. I think one of the things that it's important to note about this work, which is that yes, it is about data and results and what works, and having a strong infrastructure that is going to create some real meaningful change and sustain it over the long haul. I do think, though, what this all represents is something even bigger than that, which is creating a new muscle in communities that builds civic confidence, that communities can actually solve things that they may have thought were intractable challenges, that they can build the confidence that things can be solved and the hardest challenges can be tackled, and that success can be achieved if you just work differently and work harder and work smarter in a very different way. And what I see in so many communities where we're doing this work is that there's a newfound confidence in how people go about even building relationships with each other, working differently together in ways that allows them to then take some success and even transfer it, to your point, to another issue. I use this example a lot, and I know there are folks here from Milwaukee, but the work that our Unite Way has done in Milwaukee around teen pregnancy, not alone, but with a lot of folks in Milwaukee, where that community has been able to really have significant progress made on reducing teen pregnancy, that civic confidence now is translating into new areas, like around infant mortality. And so people are beginning to say, look, if we can figure this out in terms of not just what are the systems and the data and the sort of the processes that have to be in place in order to make this work, but if we can actually figure out that as a community we can actually build a kind of community problem-solving skill sets and confidence that actually allows us to take problem solving on one issue, take it to another issue, to me that's real success. Because I think at the end of the day what we're trying to get to is this point of real solutions that have meaningful results and having communities work differently together where they may be overcoming past challenges of what they've attempted to do before and haven't been successful in the past. So I think that's really one of the biggest things that I'm seeing from some of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it gets back to the sort of building the muscles of collaboration that you were talking about, Patrick. And one of the things that we have found too is that it's important to have an issue that you're starting with to sort of help to build those muscles up. But once you get that civic confidence you're talking about, Stacey, sort of that you're seeing examples of them being able to, the community then being able to take on other issues and be successful there as well. Yeah. Curious about reactions to that.
I think, we've seen a number of things along that line. The way I look at it, if you look at a lot of the cities around the country where we do most of our work, which is cities, which is, there used to be a civic infrastructure that took on hard problems. And over the years, they dissolved in many places. Oftentimes it was led by business leaders. Sometimes it was an old boys club. I'm not saying it was structured in a way that was perfect, but there were people that basically said, we believe that there are certain things that we as a community need, and we have to go attack them. And I think in many ways what we're talking about here is rebuilding that civic infrastructure. But what it really does require is leadership. And I actually do think that its funders have to be part of that leader. I know the Baltimore story really, really well. The leadership that these guys took was extraordinary, including using a huge chunk of their balance sheet to make the thing work. But the reality is you can't be a passive funder in this kind of work. You have to have a point of view. And that means you're not doing just responsive grant making. The YMCA, nothing wrong with the YMCA, but they come in and say they need a new basketball floor. That is different than you having a point of view about how juvenile justice has to be changed. The other part of it is most people don't have the skills to do this work at all. We are trained to be technically proficient. We're lawyers, we're accountants, we're teachers. We had a body of work and we were expert at it. And this kind of work requires a humility that you don't know the answer, and it requires a table of people with humility. That's rare anywhere. And then there has to be this, the table and the people managing the table have to understand how change happens in that environment, which is just very, very different. I think Patrick used the word adaptive. You had emergent on the screen. I mean, that type of, most people don't have those skills, and so they need to be trained in that, and that costs money and time too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Casey, of course, has been a leader in the field around results-based leadership and building the capacity of leaders. Patrick, are there any lessons that you would learn, you sort of take away from that work? And
I'll be brief, I promise. But I think the field as a whole, the collective impact field, perhaps has not paid enough attention to the development of individual leaders and then networking them together, that sort of dual type of thing. I think it happens somewhat organically and naturally, and we talk about that. But I actually think that might be one of the many next frontiers in this work, is to deliberately identify people who may not today be a prominent leader, but has the potential, and that a collective impact scenario is an opportunity for someone at that table, some senior leader, to say, you know what, I'm going to send Patrick to that table, and I'm going to actually ask the group as a whole to invest in Patrick so that down the road he'll have that adaptive sort of skills. I think that's something the field ought to take up with a lot more seriousness. Our work at Casey is really focused on a particular type of leadership, and it's called results-based leadership because it's all around these kinds of skills. But there's lots of different ways to do it. I just think we're not attending to the next generation of leaders as those of us who came up in the 60s, Junious, or taking on different leadership challenges.
Junious, I'd love to hear from you about this leadership part in particular. And Ben talked about the fact that some of the traditional leadership tables or traditional power structures in community were not particularly inclusive. What does it mean to set the leadership table in this work, in collective impact work, and to be inclusive in doing that?
It's a real challenge, and I do appreciate your comments, Patrick, because the challenge for us, we're in an extremely diverse community in Oakland, as is the rest of the Bay Area, with a lot of segmentation across the racial, ethnic, sexual preference, every sort of dimension of human difference. And figuring out how to do representation is mind-boggling. And from my days as trying to think that everybody needed to be at the table, and it may be just I'm getting older and tired, that, you know, I've actually, you know, been experimenting in the work around smaller leadership tables to work something out, obviously fraught with problems in terms of who doesn't get the table, but we just had a process going in Oakland, and, you know, we had 40-some people at a table, and still got massive criticism that it wasn't big enough. But Patrick's framing, I think, is one of the lessons and one of the challenges for me. There are issues around equity, inclusion, and power that if we don't get them right, we'll be awaiting the next cycle of problems. The structural inequality in this country, racial discrimination, are at the heart of many of the social problems that we're trying to use collective impact to attack. And it's not something that you can Band-Aid over. And so the courageous conversations that need to happen around race, and I don't even use diversity that much anymore. It's really inclusion. Everybody can figure out diversity. If you can't, you're pretty stupid. You just have to look around. It's really inclusion. And how is it that you make people feel welcome and that you really draw in the skills and expertise that all that diverse population brings. The power dynamics are overwhelming, and Ben's reference to an earlier civic structure dominated by white males. We really need to balance this challenge between having people at the table who can move resources, human and financial resources, and your broader definition that there are some human resources, like we're trying to entice our base building groups to come into collective impact, and frankly, they're quite skeptical. We've got PICO affiliates, ACE, AKA old Acorn affiliates, as well as a whole variety of locals, and they're extremely skeptical about the power dynamics of the collective impact and where base building groups fit into this. We've been able to get them at a few of the tables. I share that concern because ultimately, and this is a rather crude way of stating it, I look around the table and these are the same people in terms of the public agencies who've had control of these resources for the last 50 years. It is simple-minded to think that somehow just the dynamic of this collaborative working together is going to change the base power dynamics, and Ben alluded to them. They benefit, you know, we're in a county in Alameda County that has the highest reserve of any county government in the state of California. And it's difficult to have a conversation with somebody with a $1.7 billion deficit or a surplus in reserves, and they're supposed to be the safety net. That was generated on the backs of poor people in Alameda County. So the power dynamic around dealing with our county administrator, the base building groups are not going to come to a table to have polite conversation. This is stuff around action. So the whole dynamic of power and race and equity, and the questioner for Patrick alluded to this. We don't form any outcomes in our organization that aren't framed around the sort of universal outcome that we're trying to seek and closing gaps for the different populations within our community. The work is really as much about closing the gaps as it is about raising the standards of performance. So we don't have any particular solutions, but it's troublesome because down the road on some of these things, people who haven't been included, we're going to be the subject matter of the actions that base builders and others take. So figuring out how to manage that, to have the courageous conversations about race and about power and inclusion, at least are, I think, an important part of the foundation. Not that we're going to resolve them, you know, in a year or two, but at least creating the climate where people know that we're willing to confront those issues, to talk about them, to figure out strategies to minimize the way that they impact on the things that we collectively want to achieve.
I just want to reflect on something that what Junious was talking about and this talent and leadership question, because I think one of the things that we can't ignore is that there's a strong correlation, in my mind, between the most successful collective impact efforts and where there's strong leadership. And I think it would be probably not a correct notion for funders to think that when they're investing in these issues, if you're investing in some concept, it's really important to be clear that you also need to be thinking about the actual people who are behind the effort. I mean, I think we talk a lot about organizational capacity, and I think it's right to think about those things. But organizations are people, right? I mean, these efforts are often led by people who are the kinds of leaders who are bold and courageous, who are smart, who hold themselves accountable, who are willing to hold others accountable, who are willing to be politically savvy, who are willing to know, to have the skill set to know what needs to be said publicly, what needs to be said privately. There are all kinds of hard skills and soft skills that come along with the kind of leadership that both gets through the muddy beginning phases, right? The very difficult and dangerous beginning phases of this, to a place where it can be, where you can see real results and then achieve some degree of change over time. When I look at our own United Way system, and we play a unique role in this because we're funders sometimes, and increasingly, what I'd like to see of us is that we're also, and increasingly more, the backbone organization behind some of these efforts, which I think United Ways are, and others are too, are uniquely capable of playing. But it does require us to make an investment in our own leadership, and we've actually done that. We actually have a whole new leadership program that is designed specifically to help train folks who are willing to pursue this kind of leadership in developing the skills. We are actually looking at, with local United Ways and their boards, the kinds of leaders that we can attract into the organization who can assume these roles, and the kinds of CEOs, some of them that are here today, that are coming into United Way today are not the CEOs of 30 years ago. At one point in our network, it was, if you knew how to be a great fundraiser, that was the #1 thing to get the job. Now it's, sure, you've got to be good around resource development, but you've got to be skilled and at these kinds of efforts, because in order to lead a community's efforts around change, you've got to be able to provide the kind of leadership that's going to get through some of these difficult challenges and actually help the community to sustain some sort of results over time. So it's interesting to see how this whole talent and leadership, I know Paul Schmitz is probably going to talk about this later too, has really changed the landscape both in communities. It's changed the landscape of our own network. It's changed the very nature of how we think about the work and the kinds of people that we need, even in developing new talent along the way in the pipeline of talent in our own network. It's actually given us a whole new philosophy about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, there's a real reason why leadership is such a strong theme this afternoon. We've seen it to be critical again and again. And it does require a different role from funders in terms of identifying leaders, supporting leaders, building that capacity.
And being one. That's
being
the point
leaders.
I really
That's right. No, I think that's
obsessing
right.
on.
Yeah.
It's like there is no reason, there is no legal restriction from being a leader in your community, meaning you're at the table just like the other leaders.
Right. Yeah.
And I would say the most effective places that we've seen, if I could find one common thread, it's that there is one or more philanthropic leaders at the table with a point of view, and then there's somebody else too that is a strong leader. So that's the other part. You have to have at least two,
right.
So you have some resilience, because people do leave.
You have to have somebody to work with.
Yeah, right, and it's not fun. But I think you really do. I think you really need redundancy on the leadership front. But I want to say one more thing about race and disparities, which I think the other thing we've really learned a lot about this. And I don't know if Jeff Edmondson is in the room, but yeah, Jeff, we talk about this all the time. But the data, and funders can fund this data, funding the data that shows those discrepancies is really important, and nobody wants you to, because they really don't want to look at those because they're horrible. Because you break it down and you say, yeah, we're only at, we're at 60% third grade reading. We need to get to 100. Well, like, who are those 40%? Well, they're all the kids of color that are in 3 schools. And breaking down the data and then saying, well, that's what we're going to use to say whether or not we're moving the needle, And understanding that that's the problem
Yeah.
is a real, I call it the third rail. I really do think it is the hardest part that people can get. And you talked about this. They can get to the general goals, but it's when you get down to those issues, which really does open up all of the issues of race and class and all of that is, funders really need to fund that stuff because nobody else is going to fund it.
And it's a critical piece to fund, right? Because it's unsexy, it's expensive, it's time consuming, there's not necessarily an immediate
and you need
return,
it over time.
But you need it over time, that's right.
And
Yeah.
there, I'd also push us to go to the next level because we collectively, again, I think have gotten better at simply disaggregating data, right, and sort of showing who's where. We're not very good at the story behind the numbers. And in fact, going from descriptive to really analytic,
Right.
which really does require a whole lot of courageous conversation. It is not an accident.
Right.
So the wealth disparity isn't, let's just talk about the gap.
Right.
It's, so how did that happen? And knowing how it happened, how does it change over time, really gets directly to not only historical racism that has occurred and systemic and structural barriers, et cetera. It goes to today, and we don't even have to be intentional about it, right? That's the scary thing.
Right.
We don't even have to be intentional about it. So I just push this in addition to sort of calling out the disparities, the story behind the disparities, and the data that reveal the story behind the disparities will help open up what we can do with that.
And I would add another point about the data and building a data infrastructure, and make a couple of points. One is that, and a couple of people have referred to it, that success breeds the willingness and interest of people moving to other issues. I mean, that's one of the things that we've known a long time about effective collaborative work, and it's probably even more so with collective impact. But the issue, the interrelatedness of the social problems that we're likely to move through suggests the need to have data systems that are really robust enough to see the interrelationship between the various problems that we're going to encounter. And it's coupled, I think, with a couple of other movements that I think it's important for philanthropy to connect to this work. One is open data, that we as a society have put millions and billions of dollars into data, most of which is in the hands of custodians in public agencies, and they never release it to anybody because they think they own it rather than are custodians for it. So the open data movement to get government to make their data readily available is really critical because it generates, if you look at San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Chicago, a whole wave of innovation by the coders developing tools to use the public data, and the highest best use of a lot of the data isn't the bureaucrat who's a custodian, but it's probably somebody else outside of them. That's a foundation for the issue that we also need to deal with, which is transparency and accountability in government. One of my moans and groans all the time is we only have one big public system that we have any infrastructure of accountability for, and that is public schools. May not like it. It has all sort of imperfections I would agree with, but at least we got something. Talk about healthcare, juvenile justice, social services, all these other big systems. We've got no fundamentals of accountability for them, and we know a basis of accountability is it's data driven. What is it that you were supposed to be accomplishing, and how far have you gotten? So I guess part of what I want to say is that there's a big data piece here that ties to the open data movement, to government transparency, to getting, as Casey did, I know when they worked with us in Oakland around results-based accountability embedded in government. So we have some performance measures against which to hold people accountable. I would make one other point. In the heyday of Silicon Valley and the tech movement, we couldn't get enough assistance in computers for nonprofits. we have really flipped it. Most nonprofit organizations are going to need resources to build their data and information technology infrastructure. It's not that folks don't want to look at results, it's that they've got old, decrepit systems and inadequate training and not enough assistance, and that becomes really important. I make this point, tying together what government has in its systems with what nonprofit and other providers have in their system is really critical. You need to know what are the interventions that all of us have made with this kid and family, and what's worked and not worked, and what combination and dosage do things work. And we've got half of the delivery system with no data, with absolutely no data that they can help inform their practice and their improvement, or help us get a big picture about what's working and not working in terms of can we make effective decisions around where we invest scarce resources. So I think that's a big thing for philanthropy. I know it's onerous and it's big and it ain't sexy to fund that, but if this stuff is going to work, it's premised on us having really powerful state-of-the-art data infrastructure and systems to let us do what you can do now fairly easily given the state of information technology. And that's an investment that we found, and I think most places have found the hardest to get. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a kid with a basketball or a lunch or any of those sorts of things.
Right. Yeah. And you're right, I'm so glad that the data piece came up, because the funders really do have a critical role to play in unlocking both public data and, as you're saying, Junious, to build the capacity of all the players to actually use that data, analyze that data, and use it to learn, to improve, to go forward as well.
And collect their,
So I know we're actually just, we're just at the end of our
started.
time. I know, we're just getting started. We could easily go for a couple, another couple hours.
I just want to say collect the right data, because there's a bunch of data, and we find in education, for example, we're not even collecting the right data to identify the right kids who are at risk to develop the right targeted interventions. With all this data, if we could collect it, it still wouldn't give us the answer. We've got to figure out what's the right data you need to get to the right solution. So thank you for allowing me to say that.
No, I mean,
and that's really sexy, by the way.
Such a great, it is sexy, right? That's how you get to change. That's what makes it sexy. So this has been great, and thank you all so much for providing your insights from your own experience. We've touched on a lot of different areas, of course, sort of the structure of collective impact, the importance of leadership and cultivating leadership, the importance of inclusion in this work, the importance of data. And I know we will have many other sessions to continue the conversation over the course of the next couple of days. But a huge round of applause for our wonderful panelists. It's really fantastic.